Welcome to Square Notes, the Sacred Music Podcast. Your chance to learn about the teachings of the Catholic Church on sacred music, both in theory and practice. Through interviews, discussions, and music, your hearts and minds will be lifted up and better understand what it means to sing the praise of His glory. And now, your hosts, Peter Carter and Dr. Jennifer Donaldson.
Hello, listeners, and welcome to Square Notes, the Sacred Music Podcast. I'm flying solo today, and I have as my guest Dr. Timothy OMalley, who serves as the Director of Education at the McGrath Institute for Church Life at the University of Notre Dame. He's also the Notre Dame Center for Liturgy's academic director. He's a noted scholar in the areas of liturgical and sacramental theology, catechesis, aesthetics, and marriage. He's the author of numerous books and articles, most recently the forthcoming book, Divine Blessing, Liturgical Formation in the RCIA. But beyond all those things, Tim is a man who lives his faith and his vocation to marriage and to being a father very well. And as a result, I have him on the show today to talk about the participation of small children, little children, in the sacred liturgy. And since this is a sacred music podcast, we'll be paying special attention to the involvement of children in singing and in children's choirs. Thanks so much for joining us today, Tim.
Oh, it's so good to be here with you.
Since we're talking about the participation of children in the liturgy as our topic today, it seems helpful to begin with an explanation of what active participation in the liturgy means, when understood as the Church understands it. Perhaps some of our listeners aren't familiar, for example, with the history of the phrase and its meaning. Could you explain this a bit?
Sure. I think one of the problems with the term active participation is we insert so much kind of modern philosophical baggage with it. If you look at the history often of prayer, one of the things, especially liturgical prayer, is that one of the emphasis that was put on in the modern age was that one had to absolutely understand and to have the kind of sincerity that you totally understood what was going on every moment of the liturgical act, and that if you simply engaged in it without true and absolute sincerity, then it was an inauthentic act. And I think we often take this image of authentic participation in when we hear the phrase. But of course, authentic participation, or active participation rather, it really pertains, I think, more to a kind of actual participation. It's the participation of our whole self. Everything about ourselves is given over unto God, right? So as a term, it means a participation of the full person, body and soul, mind and heart. Certainly part of this is understanding, right? It's an understanding of what's going on, but it's not a literal everyone doing everything, a kind of perpetual frenetic activity where each person moves and does the exact same things. And it's important to get this right, I think, especially when we're talking about children, right? Because in some ways, children can participate actively, even infants, even if they're not able, for example, to make every response in the dialogue at Mass. They can participate actively, even if they don't understand or grasp everything that's going on in the homily. And if I'm honest with myself, I also participate actively, even when I don't understand everything that's going on. That the true sort of participation is an actual participation, a true participation in which the full gift of self is given, in which one is properly disposed in the mode that's appropriate to be disposed, depending upon your age and what kind of spiritual life you have, to be properly disposed to worship God. And so I think one of the ironies of the way we interpret active participation is that it actually ends up excluding children rather than including them.
Could you talk a little bit more about that? What are some sort of things that you've seen that specifically circumvent authentic participation for children?
Well, I think one of the top things that I see is just the huge amount of words and explanation, right? So to be honest, it prevents participation for me too. You end up with so much speech that there's no understanding that's going on, right? Like a child has not the capacity to understand a 15, 20-minute discourse. And so with the elimination of music, with the elimination of image, with the elimination of sound, one of the things we do is we actually make it impossible or far more difficult for children to be able to participate. We also have an approach which everything must be explained. So it's related to verbosity, but it's the sense that, true participation in liturgy means I have to say, for example, that this candle is Christ, that the altar is Christ, that now we're about to do this thing. And of course, children don't need that. Children are willing to do the thing, and they actually learn to do the thing and to enter into the Christian life through the use of their bodies. That's a sort of another dimension, I think, of the liturgy, that often the reform of the liturgy, I think, focused so extensively on words. It didn't attend to the body and to the way that we sort of move, right? There was often a sort of pushing out of devotional practice, of genuflecting, of kneeling, all those sort of embodied actions that actually allow children to worship God. I mean, to sort of concretize this as an example, I have never to my son is 6 years old. I've never said to him, hey, Tommy, I'd like to engage in a relatively extensive discourse with you on reverence. Rather, what we've done is that when we enter church, we genuflect. And he's now learned to genuflect. And he genuflects as an act that later on, once his intellectual life develops, once understanding develops, we can have a conversation about reverence that's actually lived out in his very body. And so we have forgotten, I think, the body, music, material culture in the act of participation. And in this sense, we exclude not simply children. We exclude those with special needs. We exclude those that don't have the full knowledge of the Christian tradition when they enter into the liturgy. Ironically, the more words we use in the liturgy, the less participatory it is.
So, contextualizing words in sacred music, many of our listeners are interested in the role of sacred music in helping children to participate in the liturgy. In that regard, what are some of the songs that you teach your children, and how do you incorporate sacred music in your daily devotions as a family? Do they like learning new music or singing the same things? What are some of the things you sing?
So the first thing that we sing is just the chant of prayer. So early on, when we were first teaching our kids to pray, we, of course, didn't sing immediately everything. We thought, well, surely they would have no interest in this. But at some point, we realized, that our son was trying to burn the house down, and that actually we needed some way to grasp his attention a bit more fully. And so the first thing we learned to sing was simply in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, to use very simple chant tones. You don't have to be an expert as a family to do this, to actually sort of teach them to sing. So they actually end up learning all sorts of parts of the liturgy, even within the home. So they learn how to respond, Amen, almost immediately. And they also see an immediate connection between what happens at Mass and what happens in the home.
Are you teaching them some things in Latin as well, or is everything that you're usually singing parts of the liturgy in English?
We do, in fact, teach them Latin. So once we started praying, actually, one of the very next things that we did was to sort of teach them the Marian antiphons in Latin. And so our children would pick up these Marian antiphons, and they would pick up the Our Father in Latin. And they began to learn these sort of basic Latin texts, which they enjoy and delight in. I mean, actually, it's somewhat moving. Our son had to have blood drawn within the first 3 days of his life. And it was a traumatic experience because they couldn't find a vein. And there's nothing like watching a 3-day-old unable at all to understand what's going on, and yet having this needle pricked into him again and again. And the very first song we actually sang him was the Salve Regina. And so we've had a certain devotion to teaching him that Latin text as he's grown up. But yeah, he knows all the seasonal Marian antiphons at this stage and is able to sing along with them, as well as sing along to the Latin in church. He's able to sing the Mass propers because he kind of hears them along with us. And so he's grown up with this capacity to sing in Latin and in English because it's just part of what we've done in the home. Children want to sing these things. They delight in singing these things, whether in English or in Latin. And even if they don't even fully understand the words, they already understand in singing that they're praising God.
That's really beautiful. I hadn't thought of it quite that way. What do you think about in terms of children who are old enough, for example, to participate in a choir at Mass? What do you think the role is of participating in that as a liturgical sort of ministry for children's understanding and incorporation into actual participation?
For me, I think the number one way to get children a proper liturgical formation is to get them into a choir as quickly as possible. It certainly is, as long as they're able to sing. You know, our son is 6 and he's participating in a children's choir, learning basic sacred music right now. And it provides the most perfect liturgical formation possible, because the child from the very beginning of his or her life are immersed into the sacred texts that matter, right? So they're already immersed into this act of singing in praise of Christ, in praise of God. They know the tradition. It's actually written in their very bodies. And so choirs, to me, are integral to the evangelization. It's integral to retrieving an entire tradition. A good children's choir, often when you work with adults, there's often a kind of backlash, right? Oh, no, we're going to do Latin, or, oh, this is older than 1967. For a child, everything is older than them. That's the gift of being young. Everything is older, so it doesn't matter if you're talking about a composition from, 6 years ago, it's old. And so for the child, they're far more open to learning the fullness of the church's tradition in music. So the sooner we can get them into a choir and really invite them I imagine, to sing as much as they're able to sing, as quickly as they're able to sing, they really get immersed into it, to sing chant, to sing sort of basic polyphonic pieces insofar as they're able, even to sing parts. My son's children's choir, he's 6 years old, but they divide them into girls and boys and they sing harmony. So all of this is possible. It takes time, it takes immersion, but it really, I think, I can see the manner in which my son's liturgical imagination has been sanctified. And of course, when my daughter is above the age of 2, this is where she'll go too. She already is very annoyed that her brother goes to choir and she doesn't.
You talked a little bit about capturing your son's imagination through singing rather than speaking, and I think parents naturally capture this when they're telling stories, for example, to their children, that they don't read them in a monotone sort of way. They inflect their voice, but there's something often that happens in the liturgy in the notion of wanting to capitalize on that. And so sometimes a priest might make his voice kind of sing-songy at the liturgy. And I'm wondering if you've ever noticed that and its effect on your children in the liturgy versus using the actual tones of the sung Mass and the effect of that on your children in the liturgy.
Yeah, my children are, they'll pick up on speech patterns fairly well, and they pick up on sort of styles of prayer and a kind of sing-songy tone. And they've certainly learned the liturgy in this way. They're just so, they get so distracted by speech alone that what really, we went to a parish, our current parish it doesn't sing everything, but they sing in English, the opening collect, they'll sing the preface, and it will be chanted according to the ritual books. And the manner in which my children have learned these texts and learned to pay attention during these texts are sort of rather stunning. They've really sort of let it enter into their lives and enter into their imagination. So they certainly picked up on basic speech, right? Well, my son insists regularly on playing church at home, and he often wants to be a lector, and he will speak, not sing, but for as far as he knows, the only book of the Bible right now is this is the first letter of Paul to the Corinthians, and it always begins brothers and sisters, and then continues with let us go to the treehouse or something like that. But with music, it's different. I mean, everything he picks up so much intensely from the sung text, and very simple sung text. And the chant is even sort of more intense for him because he can pick it up more easily. And so, yeah, I think the temptation to adopt a kind of sing-songy tone, actually risks still not really. I know that it's meant to sort of emphasize certain affections, certain real interest in what's going on in the liturgy. But I think singing the chant is actually more helpful because it actually writes the text upon us. I should say this is not just true for kids. As I get older and my memory declines, it's far easier for me to pick something up if it's sung. And it's far easier for me to pay attention to something if it's sung rather than to have it merely spoken, even if it's spoken in a sing-songy way.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. I remember, for example, when I was student teaching that I had to teach a bunch of fourth graders a song that listed all of the presidents of the United States of America. And to this day, I can still list all of them in order because I memorized that song. We use that so often as a pedagogical tool in teaching children to memorize things. And so I guess a broader sort of question related to that is, what do you think the role of memorization is in the spiritual life of a child? Of course, this used to be a huge part of the catechetical programs, especially when it was based on the Baltimore Catechism, but it was largely de-emphasized in the past 4 or 5 decades. How do you think that the memory connects with the intellect and the will in forming a child? And why is it important not only when they're a child, but also when they're later in life to have memorized as a child prayers, chants, and teachings of the church?
Yeah, I mean, there's a certain kind of servile sense of memorization in the worst sense that I think one can react against, right? You can memorize something to master it. I grew up in the Protestant South, and all my friends, I think in 5th or 6th grade, memorized the books of the Bible in their order, or they would get up early in the morning to memorize the Bible as a sort of competition to see who won. And, I think some of the critique of memorization was against this servile approach. But of course, with any critique of something, you risk losing the thing that was most essential. And so memorization, I think I always remind my students, especially when I'm teaching catechetics, this. Memorization is not servile. Actually, memorization is the manner in which we write upon our hearts that which matters most to us. It becomes part of who we are. There's the word out there, right? There's the word of the scripture that's out there. There's the ecclesial teaching that's out there. There's the specific chant that's out there. But when it is written in my heart, when it becomes a part of my lips, when I'm able to sing it and rejoice in it, then it actually becomes mine, and I can employ it and engage in it and use it in much different ways. To return to an earlier moment, when my wife and I are gathered around our newly born son, we don't have a copy of the Salve Regina chant in front of us, the sort of basic chant. But because it's part of us, we're able to sort of produce it at the moment where we most need it. It's part of who we are. And so with young children, we have to give them all the tools and instruments that will enable them to have that which they need to adore God, not just now, but as they get older. And so memorization isn't bad. It's not an evil. And I think the easiest way actually to teach memorization is at this young age. Children who before the age of 7 who memorize and pick up everything with ease. It's like learning a language. And so I think we have to be even more open to the possibility of this memorization, of really inviting these young kids in to memorize these texts, these prayers. And then also, for us adults who maybe didn't memorize everything, perhaps we were part of curricula that didn't emphasize this. Our kids are an occasion, I think, to take it back up, to spend the time now of memorizing something, of letting it become part of our lives, memorizing the Psalms, memorizing these hymns and these chants and these texts. It's just part of, I think, the formation of a mature Christian has a wellspring of things in their memory.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think about it from both the spiritual and the musical aspect of it. Any choir director knows that something that a choir has memorized, they sing better, or something a congregation has memorized, they sing better, and they sing more together, more in tune, and they're able to just produce better music. But there's a sort of synchronism there, I think, with how we're able to remember and recall and pray texts when they are learned by heart. There's a sort of perfection, I think, that can emerge from that doesn't always emerge when something is learned that's new. Of course, that's not always true, and it is good to learn new things. But it seems that there's a sort of excellence that comes with memorization.
Yeah, I think that's a sort of a brilliant point. There is this sort of excellence that comes into us. It becomes part of who we are. It's a delight. It is what we love. I always teach whenever I'm teaching a course on the sacrament of marriage, I always urge my students, of those who will get married, to memorize their vows, because it's one thing to say them once, repeating them after someone, but actually you can write them in your heart. You can have them as part of who you are. They become defining of who you are. And of course, you need to make sure you memorize them properly so that it's both it's a valid liturgy, a valid sacrament. But
Good point. Changing gears a little bit, could you talk about things like processions or May crownings, Christmas pageants, those sorts of things in the life of a child? How do these sorts of things help the imagination or help shape the imagination and impress the faith deeply on the heart and mind of a child?
yeah, I think actually the thing we lost most after the reform of the council was a certain kind of liturgical, there ended up being this kind of liturgical myopic vision that you would get everything that you would need in the Christian life as long you would attend the liturgy. And so I think one of the things that happened is we lost all sorts of dimensions of liturgical drama and of a life, an aesthetic life that was festive and joyful and that was part of being human. And so I think it's essential to the life of a child to participate in things like May crownings. On our own campus, we host an event with families and lots of kids where we have the May crowning, and we have some of our undergraduates place rose petals along the way as the Blessed Virgin Mary, as we process with her towards a place where we'll crown her in front of our building, and then we have cookies. This immerses itself into the life of a child. They are fascinated by something so beautiful that you would throw rose petals for it, and that you would do this. The same thing with sort of nativity plays and other forms of liturgical drama. It allows people to enter into the drama of salvation and to do so in a way that's actually kind of transformative of them. And actually, this is for kids and for me. I'm teaching the York Mystery Plays right now in a majors level theology course, and there's something about the pedagogy of these plays that you can see that they're encouraging a kind of union of imagination with the actual kind of conception of salvation history, but throwing in certain liturgical interjections that then return with the one who's participated or seen these plays to the actual liturgical life itself. And it becomes enriched in the process, right? So the way that I've always explained this in class is we've often said the liturgy is formative and it's the most formative. And that's broad, that I agree with that. But the liturgy is formative of the human person, and everything we do is formative, and we bring everything into it. And so to be a man, to be a woman, is to have these experiences that allow us to worship more fully. So with kids, and actually with everyone, I think the larger the devotional life, the larger that we tap into the great tradition of liturgical drama, of liturgical prayer, or of all drama, not just liturgical drama, that what we end up doing is we enrich the capacity to really engage the liturgy.
That's a great point. And I think it plays into how we keep Sunday as well. For example, that you dress up to go to Mass on Sunday, and that can be something fun for children, or that, part of your Sunday routine is that you make homemade pasta afterwards, or go out for hamburgers, or eat cookies, like you said, and that it's a whole sort of experience of an embedding of the liturgy in a beautiful and enjoyable Christian life. I know for myself, I always enjoyed on Sundays when I could spend time at brunch with my friends after Mass. Sometimes we would go, to a 9:30 Mass and end up going to brunch until 5 p.m. or something like this.
Yeah, no, I think we have forgotten that Catholicism is delightful. And the more it actually takes over every dimension of our lives, the more delightful it becomes, the more that it structures every part of our lives. Monsignor Luigi Giussani from Communion and Liberation notes that we know that something is taken when actually it begins to take over our free time, where we actually engage in it fully, and it's taken over every dimension of our lives. And so that's a perfect example. The brunch, the cookies, the festivals, these are all, I think, important for a flourishing Catholic culture, which I believe is essential for this liturgical culture to flourish too.
So again, I'd like to change gears a bit and dive into something that's perhaps a little bit more controversial. I've heard so many different sorts of perspectives on this, and there's been a lot of talk over the past few months on social media about the noise that children make at Mass. What's your take on this, and what also would you say to weary parents who feel like they can't pray at Mass and themselves actively or authentically participate?
Yeah, I was just talking to some parents last night online actually about this. And I think there are extremes in this argument that I think have to be cared for and to be avoided. The first extreme is that, children should make whatever noise they want in church and don't worry about it. Never take your kid out. It doesn't matter if they're, stamping around and throwing things. That's just what it means to be a kid. I think the other extreme is that no kid should ever make any sound ever. But of course, that is insane because kids make sounds. 4-month-old babies just randomly scream things out. Our daughter we work on her and we're teaching a certain tone at church, but sometimes she just, I suppose, is filled with the Spirit and screams something out. And so, I think the essential dimension is the ideal is a silent space where we can really sort of adore the living God, and that kids sometimes make this complicated. And parents, if the kid is crossed a boundary, and we all know where that boundary is, there's nothing wrong with taking them out. And I actually spend a lot of time out of church with my daughter, and because she wants to wander around and she's not happy at this stage. She's 2 years old, and where, as an adult is able to focus on one particular thing closely, a child needs to focus on many things very closely. And so they need to often move around. So I take my daughter out. I think the thing I told parents last night is, it is somewhat interruptive for my life of prayer in the liturgy on Sundays at Mass. I'm not always going to be able to sort of contemplate the sacrifice of Christ and to offer my own life in such a way that I'm deeply attentive, at what's going on in the Eucharistic liturgy. But on the other hand, I'm also, at the same time, offering the sacrifice in the mode that I'm able right now, right? So it returns back to our original discussion of active participation. Is what does it mean for a dad who's schlepping around with a 2-year-old slightly on the borders outside the church? So I can hear what's going on, but I can't see everything. What does it mean to participate? Well, I am participating. I'm there. I'm offering, I'm singing the chants as best as I can. I'm offering actually my very relationship with my daughter. And I'm actually along the way, by the way, rediscovering the gift of our tradition, because my daughter is pausing along the way to contemplate an image of the Annunciation. And I'm talking to her about what the Annunciation is and rediscovering a love of my own faith. And so in this sense, I'm not a rigid person on this question because I worry about rigidity on it. Kids have been at Mass forever. I want to create a sacred space. And I want parents to be able to adore the living God. But I think sometimes you can actually learn to do that from your kids, even when you're wandering around corridors.
That's a great point. To close, could you talk a little bit about the role of interacting with sacred and beautiful objects as it is envisioned in the pedagogy of Maria Montessori and the Catechesis of the Good Shepherd? And maybe a bit about why are reality and beauty so important in the life of a child?
Yeah, I think one of the things that I've noticed textbook companies do, almost every liturgical company does, that publishes, is that they tend to think if they're creating something for children, make it cartoonish. And listen, my kid loves cartoons. He's delighted in the show on Amazon called Stinky and Dirty. It's the story of a garbage truck and a garbage truck and a construction equipment that solves problems. He loves them. But my child has a bit more range than Stinky and Dirty. He loves beautiful music. He loves organs. He loves art that actually sort of attracts him and makes him say, what is it? And I think our task as parents, as a church, as those involved in liturgical music ministry, is to invite people to encounter all that is most beautiful and most real. And I think until we get used to doing this with pleasure, until we recognize that children have much more capacity than we've given them credit for, we're going to continue to be in the problem we are, which is that children grow addicted to things that are not beautiful, and they don't think it's real. And so Montessori, education is always toward the real. It's toward engaging in the real. And the more that we can have the child discover the full beauty of the tradition, the true beauty of the cross, the full beauty of the resurrection narrative, not to give them some sort of paltry version, but to give them the full version, to give them the Eisenheim altarpiece, to give them the Miserere, to give them these texts, these images, these sounds that are full of reality. Until we do that, we're going to continue to have kids say to themselves, you know what, this wasn't true all along. So beauty reality is necessary if we actually want to sort of recreate a Catholic life that sustains people beyond 8 years old.
This has been so helpful, Tim. Where can parents or music directors, music ministers find out more about your work?
The easiest place to go is churchlife.nd.edu. That's our journal. And then you can also go to mcgrath.nd.edu. That's the website for the Center for Liturgy, where I serve as academic director.
Great. Thank you so much for joining us today. It's been really a joy to talk to you and to hear your ideas about this, especially how you live them as in your life as a father.
Yeah, thanks so much for asking great questions.
Thanks so much for listening to today's episode. If you'd like to learn more, be sure to check out our upcoming classes this summer 2019 at St. Joseph's Seminary in Yonkers, New York. Especially note, we have a class beginning on June 3rd, 2019, and it begins with 8 weeks online, followed by 2 days in person. It's called Principles of Sacred Music, and in it you'll learn the history of sacred music, study church documents and papal legislation on sacred music, and discuss practical issues that are involved in music ministry. More information about Principles of Sacred Music, as well as our other classes, Principles of Chant, Teaching Gregorian Chant to Children, and Introduction to the Organ for Pianists, can be found on our website, sacredmusicpodcast.com. Just click on the Upcoming Events tab, and you'll see a list of these classes and other national and regional conferences on sacred music. We'll see you next time on Square Notes, the Sacred Music Podcast.
We hope you've enjoyed listening to Square Notes, the Sacred Music Podcast, with Peter Carter and Dr. Jennifer Donaldson. For more information about this episode, sacred music resources, or upcoming events, visit our website at sacredmusicpodcast.com. You can subscribe to our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, YouTube, SoundCloud, or your favorite podcast app. If you enjoy our podcast, please write us a review on iTunes. This improves our iTunes ranking and helps others find out about the podcast. The music you heard at the beginning of this episode is Hec Dies by William Byrd, sung by the London Oratory Schola Cantorum Boys Choir, directed by Charles Cole, from the CD Sacred Treasures of England. The music at the conclusion of this podcast is the first movement of Trio Sonata No. 6 in G major by Johann Sebastian Bach, performed by Peter Carter. We look forward to having you join us next time, and until then, may we sing the praise of His glory.